Welcome to Overanalyzing House of the Dragon. In this series, we're going to go in depth, examining the source material of the upcoming series House of the Dragon, so that you can fully understand the nuance of what's being put to screen. This will be a rigorous line-by-line analysis, so be prepared for a long ride. We will have many parts to this. So, House of the Dragon is obviously a prequel to Game of Thrones, which is based on George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire book series. However, House of the Dragon itself is largely based on the latter half of George R. R. Martin's Fire and Blood Part 1, published in 2018, the bulk of which is a fix-up comprised of The Rogue Prince, published in 2014 in the short story collection Rogues, and The Princess and the Queen, published in 2013 in the short story collection Dangerous Women. And there are some small differences between Fire and Blood and these earlier works. Now, many have called Fire and Blood George R. R. Martin's Silmarillion, which is really a very misleading, if not downright incorrect comparison to make. Yes, Tolkien's Silmarillion can be viewed as a history book of sorts to support Lord of the Rings, and Fire and Blood can be viewed as a history book of sorts to support A Song of Ice and Fire, but they differ tremendously. Primarily, the Silmarillion is written as literal truth. The events described happen as they are written. The reader is not supposed to question or reinterpret things. With Fire and Blood, on the other hand, the reader is continuously presented half-truths and multiple perspectives, and is forced to puzzle out what actually occurred. George R. R. Martin put together Fire and Blood in a manner to parallel how history from centuries ago is presented to a modern reader. It's biased, pieced together haphazardly, and often based on second and third-hand accounts that are also biased. The real truth on what happened is hazy, and in most cases will never be fully known. For example, in our own history, the life of, say, Emperor Nero is largely based on two historians, Suetonius and Tacitus, who often contradict each other, who produced their histories 50 years after Nero's death under the reign of a different family's dynasty for the purpose of entertainment rather than scholarship. And their histories are largely based on the now lost histories of Fabius Rusticus, Cluvius Rufus, and Pliny the Elder, which were also mainly written for entertainment, had contradictions, and are straight-up called biased sources by Tacitus and Suetonius. Fire and Blood is presented in a similar fashion. It's written through the voice of the historian Archmaester Gyldain, who lived well after the events he's writing about, piecing together information from the histories of other maesters, septons, and a court fool, whose accounts often contradict, and whose writings we the reader have no access to because they're fictitious. And with regard to the historical bias of Fire and Blood, three important facts need to be highlighted. First, the events we're going to be talking about take place mainly during the reign of Viserys I and the war after, called the Dance of the Dragons. Viserys I was the 5th Targaryen king, and during the reigns of the 2nd and 3rd kings, Aenys and Maegor, there was a long bloody war between the Crown and the Faith of the Seven, ending with the 4th Targaryen king Jaehaerys dissolving the Faith of the Seven's military arm, the Faith Militant. Of course, the return of the Faith Militant is a major plot point in Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire. The point is, the Crown and the Faith of the Seven have had major problems that are relatively recent. And it's safe to say that septons, primary sources for Archmaester Gyldain's history, are going to have a certain view of Targaryens and dragons because of past conflict. The second important fact on bias is that we have been told in A Song of Ice and Fire that Maesters have an agenda. In A Feast for Crows, Sam Tarly makes it to the Citadel in Oldtown and meets Archmaester Marwyn, who tells Sam this: "Who do you think killed all the dragons the last time around? Gallant dragon slayers armed with swords?" He spat. "The world the Citadel is building has no place in it for sorcery or prophecy or glass candles, much less for dragons. Ask yourself why Aemon Targaryen was allowed to waste his life upon the wall, when by rights he should have been raised to Archmaester. His blood was why. He could not be trusted, no more than I can." Now again, we are going to be looking at the Dance of the Dragons and the lead up to it. And the general story in A Song of Ice and Fire on why the dragons died is that they died in battle during the Dance of the Dragons. When Marwyn claims that the Maesters killed the dragons, he is blaming the war on the Maesters, a very bold claim. Now, maybe Marwyn is wrong, and we don't know if Archmaester Gyldain himself is in on this supposed conspiracy, but even assuming he isn't, other Maesters are primary sources for his history. So on top of biased septons, we need to be looking out for biased maesters. The third important fact on bias relates to House Hightower, major characters during this period, who barely appear anywhere in A Song of Ice and Fire. However, in the A Feast for Crows appendix, we are given this description of their house. The Hightowers of Oldtown are among the oldest and proudest of the great houses of Westeros, tracing their descent back to the first men. Once kings, they have ruled Oldtown and its environs since the dawn of days, welcoming the Andals rather than resisting them, and later bending the knee to the kings of the Reach and giving up their crowns whilst retaining all of their ancient privileges. Though powerful and immensely wealthy, the lords of the High Tower have traditionally preferred trade to battle, and have seldom played a large part in the wars of Westeros. The Hightowers were instrumental in the founding of the Citadel and continue to protect it to this day. Subtle and sophisticated, they have always been great patrons of learning and the faith, and it is said that certain of them have also dabbled in alchemy, necromancy, and other sorcerous arts. So the Hightowers, who rarely get involved in conflicts, are heavily involved in this conflict, the Dance of the Dragons, out of character, and they have heavy connections to the Faith of the Seven, biased source number 1, and the Citadel, biased source number 2. It is important to note that at this point in our story, the headquarters of the Faith of the Seven, that is, the seat of the High Septon, is at the Starry Sept in Oldtown. Additionally, the headquarters of the Maesters, that is, the Citadel, is in Oldtown, and the Hightowers are the lords, formerly the kings, of Oldtown. So let's get into the text of Fire and Blood. So the Dance of the Dragons was a war between two Targaryen factions, the Blacks and the Greens. The Blacks essentially being Rhaenyra Targaryen's side with House Velaryon, and the Greens being Aegon Targaryen II's side with House Hightower. Yes, House Hightower, the house heavily connected with the Faith and the Citadel. And a good place to start on why this split between the Blacks and the Greens happened is in the chapter Heirs of the Dragon, A Question of Succession, which is about the halfway point of Fire and Blood. We're going to start in the year 92, that is 92 years after Aegon the Conqueror's coronation, during the reign of King Jaehaerys, with the Dance of the Dragons starting later after the death of his son Viserys in 129. Now, as I said, the story before us is likely a biased one, told by Archmaester Gyldain, and it appears that his sources for these events in the 90s were Septon Barth and Grand Maester Elessar. Septon Barth, by the way, was Hand of the King, King Jaehaerys' good friend, as well as a man who was an expert on dragon biology. Elessar, Jaehaerys' Grand Maester, was a very opinionated man who gained Jaehaerys' trust by saving the king's daughter's life. Barth and Elessar were Jaehaerys' most trusted advisors, meaning the Faith and the Citadel had great influence over the king. But let's begin. Heirs of the Dragon, A Question of Succession. The seeds of war are oft planted during times of peace. So has it been in Westeros. The bloody struggle for the Iron Throne, known as the Dance of the Dragons, fought from 129 to 131 AC, had its roots half a century earlier during the longest and most peaceful reign that any of the Conqueror's descendants ever enjoyed, that of Jaehaerys I Targaryen, the Conciliator. The old king and good Queen Alysanne ruled together until her death in 100 AC, aside from 2 periods of estrangement, known as the First and Second Quarrels, and produced 13 children. 4 of them, 2 sons and 2 daughters, grew to maturity, married, and produced children of their own. Never before or since had the 7 kingdoms been blessed, or cursed in the view of some, with so many Targaryen princelings. From the loins of the old king and his beloved queen sprang such a confusion of claims and claimants that many maesters believed that the Dance of the Dragons, or some similar struggle, was inevitable. And so here we are told that essentially the Dance of the Dragons was a dispute of succession, and we can note the extreme pro-Jaehaerys bias in the opening. Jaehaerys was supposedly the best, reigning over a great period of peace. Now, I'm not going to go into everything that went wrong during Jaehaerys' reign, but plenty did. There was famine, there was disease, there was war, there was unrest. Jaehaerys killed people and was horrible. He was certainly no angel. Gyldain's bias even extends to how he portrays Jaehaerys' relationship with his wife. It's somehow both this incredibly loving relationship, yet also filled with years of estrangement. But what is striking about this passage is that, On the one hand, Gyldain writes that the seeds of the Dance of the Dragons were planted during this time, but on the other hand, he applies no blame to Jaehaerys. Even though, as we will see, there is plenty of blame to lay on Jaehaerys. No system of succession existed, the previous transfers of power were all contentious and involved Targaryen infighting. Jaehaerys could have established a clear system of succession, but instead he exacerbated the problem. We can compare this to, say, how the later King Aegon the Unworthy is treated. His reign was also pretty peaceful, but he is given full blame for all of the Blackfyre rebellions because he legitimized his bastards and gifted a sword to his son. With Jaehaerys, the issue is trivialized as too many children, an inevitable event, even though Jaehaerys was the one who produced those children and, as we will see, screwed everything up with his actions. What is also ridiculous about the notion that too many Targaryens was the heart of the issue is that of Jaehaerys' 13 children, most are dead or out of the picture. Only 2 people are really relevant, Jaehaerys' son Aemon and Jaehaerys' son Baelon. And the question is essentially, should the Iron Throne pass to the first son's daughter after the first son dies, or should it go to the second son? In the end, Jaehaerys chooses the second son, Baelon over Aemon's daughter, Rhaenys, the queen who never was. It was clearly Jaehaerys' choice and not some inevitable clash. Now we get a quick mention of the 2 estrangements of King Jaehaerys and Queen Alysanne, the second of which is actually over this decision to choose Baelon. The first estrangement was over a bunch of different things, but the straw that broke the camel's back was Jaehaerys' refusal to reconcile with his daughter Sarah. Whatever the case, what's clear with the second estrangement is that Alysanne believed that Jaehaerys' choice was a bad one. She believed Jaehaerys was at fault, something that Gyldain and other Maesters refused to suggest. Somehow the Dance of the Dragons can be traced back to Jaehaerys' decision, yet he is not culpable. Now, on first glance, this seems like simple sexism. A man is chosen over a woman. But as we will see, there's a lot more going on. This was not apparent in the early years of Jaehaerys' reign, for in Prince Aemon and Prince Baelon, his grace had the proverbial heir and a spare, and seldom has the realm been blessed with 2 more able princes. In 62 AC, at the age of 7, Aemon was formally anointed Prince of Dragonstone and heir to the Iron Throne. Knighted at 17, a tourney champion at 20, he became his father's justiciar and master of laws at 6 and 20. Though he never served his father as Hand of the King, that was only because that office was occupied by Septon Barth, the old king's most trusted friend and companion of my labors. Nor was Baelon Targaryen any less accomplished. The younger prince earned his knighthood at 16 and was wed at 18. Though he and Aemon enjoyed a healthy rivalry, no man doubted the love that bound them. The succession appeared solid as stone. And so here we have an interesting comparison between the 2 sons Aemon and Baelon, where Gyldain claims they are both equally accomplished men in the year 92. Yet the actual list of accomplishments shows quite a disparity. Aemon is a knight, a tourney champion, and has been acting as Master of Laws for 12 years. And he apparently was so well respected by his father that he would have been Hand of the King without Barth. It should be noted that Septon Barth is relatively old at this point. He dies just 6 years later from what we assume are natural causes. So Aemon is not just heir to the throne, but on the verge of becoming Hand of the King. And Baelon, well, he's a knight, and he got married at 18. He has some children, and that's it. Baelon is a 35-year-old man who has done nothing vocationally that we know of. Not to mention, Aemon also got married and had a child, so Baelon isn't one-upping anyone. It is simply comical that Gyldain would claim that these men were equally accomplished. Now, Aemon being on the Small Council is interesting as, well, let's look at Jaehaerys' Small Council. As we mentioned previously, Hand of the King was Septon Barth of the Faith of the Seven, the Grand Maester is Elisar, Aemon is Master of Law, Master of Coin was likely Martin Tyrell and unofficially his wife Florence Fossway. They were chosen for their position by Septon Barth. Barth had served at Highgarden prior to coming to King's Landing. Master of Ships was Aemon's son-in-law Corlys Velaryon, and Lord Commander of the Kingsguard was likely Ryam Redwine. Here's Old Town, and this is where the Redwines are from. We don't have too many details on the Redwines during this period, but during the Dance of the Dragons, they did side with the Greens, and they were described as good friends and close kin to the Hightowers. Close kin means that marriages would have been happening during this period. So we have Septon Barth, who serves the Starry Sept of Old Town, Elisar, who serves the Citadel of Old Town, a stooge of Septon Barth, and a house with connections to the Hightowers of Old Town. The odd man out is Corlys Velaryon. And then there's Aemon. Now it's notable that Gyldayn praises Baelon for his marriage to his sister Alyssa Targaryen. But Aemon is not praised for his marriage. Aemon was married to Jocelyn Baratheon, the daughter of Rhaegar Baratheon and Alyssa Velaryon. Now, Rhaegar Baratheon and Alyssa Velaryon have a long, complicated history. But what I think is important is that Alyssa is a Velaryon, and she is the mother of many dragon riders. Most notably, she was the mother of King Jaehaerys and Queen Alysanne, as well as the dragon riders Dreamfire Rhaena and Aegon the Uncrowned. And Aemon and Jocelyn have one daughter, Rhaenys the Queen Who Never Was, who is married to Corlys Velaryon. And so we can see what's happening here politically. The Old Town forces, who currently rule the kingdom, are about to be replaced. Aemon, the next hand of the king and the next actual king, is married to a half Velaryon and is the father of a woman also married to a Velaryon. And after that, Corlys Velaryon will become king consort, and his child will become the monarch after that. The future will be a Velaryon future. So, why is that a problem? Well, one could suppose that the issue is sexism. Aemon's line leads to Rhaenys ruling. Baelon is a man. However, we will see later that Old Town forces are rather fickle on the issue of women ruling. Another issue of note is that Rhaenys is a dragon rider. She actually rode her dragon to Old Town just 3 years prior, and she insisted on arriving at her wedding to Corlys on her dragon just 2 years prior. And in the year 92, she is newly pregnant. The issue at hand may not be a Velaryon future, but a dragon future. Now, one may ask, don't other Targaryens ride dragons? And the answer is yes, but not Viserys, Baelon's heir. At least, not at this moment in time. It's a little complicated, and we'll talk about this later. But the stone began to crack in 92 AC when Aemon, Prince of Dragonstone, was slain on Tarth by a Myrish crossbow bolt loosed at the man beside him. The king and queen mourned his loss, and the realm with them, but no man was more bereft than Prince Baelon, who went at once to Tarth and avenged his brother by driving the Mirmen into the sea. And so, at a very suspicious time, right after Rhaenys, the Queen Who Never Was, discovers that she's pregnant, Aemon is called into war and dies. And I will say, Aemon's death in the Myrish conflict on Tarth does scream of conspiracy. The details on the events are laid out earlier in Fire and Blood, but essentially, Myr has been causing trouble on Tarth for a couple years at this point. In 92, though, again right after Rhaenys' pregnancy, the small council decides to send Aemon, Corlys Velaryon, and Bormund Baratheon into battle. The Velaryon fleet would protect or perhaps ferry the Stormlanders as they came over to Tarth, and they would all take on the Myrish. And so it's rather convenient for the Old Town faction. Aemon, along with his wife's house and his daughter's husband's house, are sent off into battle. And when Aemon dies, Jaehaerys must make a decision on his heir with the help of a small council that doesn't have Corlys on it. Not to mention, the Baratheon and Velaryon militaries are tied up on Tarth, so they can't make any move on King's Landing. Now it is rather odd that Aemon is sent into battle as the lone dragon rider. His dragon is Caraxes, a much smaller dragon than Baelon's Vhagar. And in previous conflicts, multiple dragon riders were dispatched. 9 years earlier, during the Dornish invasion of the Stormlands, Aemon, Baelon, and Jaehaerys all flew into battle. Not to mention, the details of Aemon's death are odd. He lands in a hidden valley in the mountains overlooking the Myrish so he can meet with the Lord of Tarth. However, some Myrish scouts supposedly make their way up, see some dragon smoke, and try to kill the Lord of Tarth with a crossbow from 100 yards away. They miss, supposedly because it's dusk, and accidentally kill Aemon. Of course, this brings up a lot of questions. How did Tarth's men not see the scouts coming up the mountain? Their position was specifically to watch Myrish movements. We have to remember that this scene somewhat parallels Jon and Stone Snake climbing a cliff in A Clash of Kings to attack some wildlings, the scene where he meets Ygritte. Jon and Stone Snake only succeed because it's the dead of night. If the Myrish are attacking at dusk, that means they're climbing during the day. And how did the Myrish get up the mountain so fast after seeing smoke? And why were scouts who rely on speed and flexibility in movement carrying around such a heavy and slow-to-load weapon as a crossbow? And how did the Myrish identify the Lord of Tarth from 100 yards away at dusk? Not to mention 100 yards is well beyond the accuracy range for a crossbow. And how do the historians know any of this? How do they know Lord Tarth was the target? Were the Myrish captured? Because we do not hear anything about that. For all we know, a paid-off soldier in Tarth's camp killed Aemon, and it was blamed on some Myrish. What's also very odd about Gildane's account is that at this moment, he claims that Baelon went to Tarth, and it was he who drove the Mirmen into the sea. Except no, earlier he specifically said that Baelon burned ships with his dragon, while Baratheon and Tarth drove the Mirmen into the sea. Baelon only played a part in the slaughter, Gildane had said earlier, and so it's striking that at this moment, when speaking of succession, Baelon's war hero status is exaggerated, as if to justify his right to the throne over Rhaenys. And we will continue with Baelon's return from Tarth and him becoming heir next time in part 2. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.